before you start preambling.
Okay.
I got it, right.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Vanilla, for coming to us. This is, as you can see, we're all very excited to talk to you. So anyway, it's all yours. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, how very, very nice to see you all. This is one of the ways I keep in touch with my father, is through cyberneticians. So seeing you all puts me very close to him again. Anyway, talking about Stafford, I was thinking this morning about how he could be described and realized that, in fact, having known him for 50 years, maybe more, I can't remember, he was several different men. He was the young man when I was born. He was the middle-aged superstar when probably you all ran across him. And then he was the older guy. I don't think he ever made old age, but he got old. And I think I can break down these three categories into his wives, into the time he spent with his different wives, the time he spent with my mother, Cynthia Hannaway, his middle life, which he spent with Sally Stedman, and then, of course, his glory years that he spent with Dr. Eleanor Leonard. And for each of those times in his life, he had quite different spiritualities. He had quite different modus operandi. And each of those periods fed into one another, so they can't really be separated out. And when I was born, he was a Roman Catholic, and he took that very seriously. He'd converted while he was at university in the company. I'm going to ramble on. If you've got any questions, or if I should elaborate or move speedily on, please wave something, yeah? So I was born Roman Catholic. He'd converted when he was at university. He was best friends with a chap called Jim Millen, who turned out to be the professor of chemistry at London University in the fullness of time. But they went through London University together down at Aberystwyth, having been evacuated because of the war. And while he was there searching, you know, he was always a searcher, Jim and he went to visit the monks at somewhere whose name I've forgotten. And there he met Father Malachi, who is quite a figure in his order. He's quite a famous monk and was a charming man. And he converted. There's a process in the Catholic Church, both Jim and Stafford, and they became members of the Catholic Communion. And this was the first break with his father, Stafford's first break with his father, who regarded this as treacherous. Once you're a Catholic, your Pope has control over you, and you are no longer enthralled to the king. So this was an act of betrayal to your country, and his father was very upset about it. And I can't help wondering if, we all know Stafford was nothing if not provocative. If that sense of provocation wasn't significant. Anyway, he became a Roman Catholic. The other sideline of that was that he then had permission to woo my mother, who was a cradle Catholic. In those days, you couldn't engage in any social sense with people who weren't from the same tribe. So Mummy's family would not have encouraged her to meet with him, and his family also. So it was called a mixed marriage if you married out of the church. But he was in the church and very quickly got engaged to my mother. At that time, she was they were both terribly young. I mean, I think they were under 18 actually, because she needed permission to marry him. And Stafford's mother told me that she thought that Cynthia's family wouldn't allow it because she was so very young, and that was her hope, you know. but they just said, oh, right ho then. And Cynthia's father gave his permission to their engagement and subsequent marriage, and died. He died in his sleep. He was 42. He had some kind of dodgy heart. So after that, I guess the die was cast. They got married in mourning. The photos are kind of austere. Stafford's wearing his captain's uniform in the Gurkhas, and Cynthia is just in a coat and stuff. Not a big Catholic ceremony. But they did have a papal blessing, of course. That was kind of normal among Catholics who knew the ropes. So then they set up home together, and he took the religious side extremely seriously. My mother always used to say that converts could never become real Catholics because they just didn't understand it. Stafford was very keen on the theological aspects, read a lot of theology, had friends among the priesthood, whereas Mummy understood the daily, how do you say, practice of Catholicism. So that's his first age, when he was a very young man. I think he was about 22 when I was born. So I knew him as not much more than a boy as far as I'm now concerned. I remember him shaving. This is before the beard. He used to have a moustache. When I first knew him, he had a pointy moustache that stuck out at the sides, which I loved. And then it became a bit more formal, just a tash and a chin. And when I watched him, I used to watch him shave. I'd sit on the bath and chatter. And I remember one day he said to me, I don't know what I'd said, but he looked at me and said, "You think I'm really old, don't you?" And of course he was really old. No question. So I didn't even reply, and he just laughed, and he said, "There are people that think I am too young for what I do." And of course now that makes sense, but I kind of not forgotten that, because it was odd, to a kid. What's he talking about? So then Catholicism, where are we? He's still a young boy. As you may know, his career moved along very quickly. He was very successful. He was very effective. And as far as I can see, he was quite fearless. I mean, he took some shocking chances. Now, looking back at what he got up to, he really, I mean, he must have been fearful, but I think he really just believed in his star. He just drove himself forward at the rate of knots. So that's his first life as a Catholic with my mother. And then in the mid-60s, when that marriage fell really very disastrously apart, he told me that he felt he'd had permission to leave the church. And so he did. And then another life started where by then he was successful, I think, by any standard. He had lots of money and had big titles and a big career. And I don't know what his spiritual practices were, except that during all this time, whenever he sat at his desk to write, which was every night, he always and unfailingly lit a stick of incense. So there was always this sacramental sense of offering and of thoughtfulness, that this was not a throwaway thing. This was an offering of significance. That is my interpretation of it. I don't know if any of you burn incense when you work, and if so, why? But in the Catholic Church, at any rate, and of course in India, in the practice of Buddhism, in any, many religious practices, incense is a key player. So he would do that and continued so to do after leaving the Catholic Church. He still read theology. He still talked about theology a lot. We talked a great deal about the Bible. He was a biblical scholar from a young age. He knew far more about it than I ever did. I mean, I speak now as someone who's subsequently trained in theology. He was very knowledgeable. Anyway, that's the sort of middle years. Then there was Chile, which changed everything. He moved to Wales, became solitary. And I think that's where the yogic practice really began to be profound. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't profound before, but he spent more time on it, shall we say. Still burning incense, of course. And then he met Elena, and alas, she's somewhere else. She's traveling today, so I can't slot her into this story.
Vanilla, sorry to interrupt, but Trevor has been waiting for the question. So,
sorry, Trevor.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Very long time ago, you and I were in a conversation face to face somewhere, and I asked you why Stafford joined the army in 1943 and chose to go to India of all the places he could have gone. And he deliberately volunteered so that he could choose to go to India rather than being called up and sent somewhere else.
Yes.
And you mentioned some kind of black sheep in the family who had a sort of dual life when they came back from India with a family in Mortlake. And could you reflect on that and say any more about that? Because I was very intrigued by that. I've never found out any more about it.
Yes, I can certainly reflect on it, but I can't substantiate anything. And I say this with authority because the young man, Gveni, someone who's doing the podcast at the moment, many of you will have spoken to him. He did some research on this and got absolutely nowhere. But my understanding is that Stafford's father was the child of a lady who had been a follower of the army in India, and he had brought her back to Barnes, Mortlake,
oh, right.
and set up house with her there, where she had 6 children. And one of them was my grandfather, who didn't find out until his mother's death, which was quite late, I think, that his mother hadn't been married, which was like, ooh, for grandpapa, you know, he was very proper indeed. This was kind of shocking business. But I think that's the story. But Uncle Ian denies it, Stafford's brother. He denies this completely and unutterably. So I got it from a cousin of the Stafford family, as well as from my mother, who talked about it quite a lot, actually. I don't know where she got it from. So I think there was a black sheep, and I think it had an Indian connection. I must also tell you that Stafford recommended John Masters to me, you know, the guy that wrote all those books about gung-ho adventures in India. I don't know if any of you have read them. I can't think of a single title, but they're boys' adventure stories. But Stafford loved those as a kid, so that may also have been significant. But I think there was a big Indian connection because the family stuff, there's lots of Indian stuff in it, you know, there's bits of ivory, maybe that was just a fashion in the day. Anyway.
Thank you.
Anything else occur at that stage? I'm just trying to think where I've got to. Oh, well, that's it really. All the ladies in, well, some of the women in his life, and that progression from Catholicism to reflection, to yogic practice. And of course, as he often pointed out, yoga means unity. So you're looking at unity, you know, unity with the world, unity with people. And I think that comes across in his work as well as in his personality, certainly towards the end of his days. So, questions, anyone?
Yes, if I might.
Please.
As you're reflecting on this, could you pinpoint any one or more issues that came up around his Catholic upbringing that caused this break? I mean, what was there, some revelation? Was it going to India? What was the trigger or triggers that caused this? I mean, was it the marriage breaking down? What was what were the events or the triggers, and how? So then the second question was, how do you think his early formation in the Catholic Church influenced his work in subsequent years, particularly in the development of the viable system model, for example, and its components? So is there two ways to, anyway, that's two questions and a lot.
It is. Can I take the last bit first? Because that's strikingly curious notion that the Catholicism and VSM may have a relationship, but thinking about it, I think the fact that Catholicism, in its nicest way, I mean, you know, if we discount the corruption and the difficulties that have become apparent, has a great deal of compassion for everybody. And a lot of the VSM seems to me to be inclusive, of course, you know, nobody's left out. So there's a great sense of, gosh, I want to say love, but of course you can't point at the VSM and say, look, love, but the inclusivity I regard as a loving thing. And I propose that could have been installed by his early engagement with Catholicism, but of course, who knows? And the other question was,
well, what was the trigger that, you know, was it a breakdown of the marriage? Was it, what was it that caused him to move from Catholicism, and what was the most immediate next spiritual engagement or intention or framing?
Okay, well, I think the breakdown of the marriage was the opportunity to leave the church, and I think that had been brewing for a while. The church had, in those days, had changed its whole format. The universal and Catholic, sorry, the universal Catholicism had evaporated. There was no longer this sense of the same church everywhere. They'd moved over to English, they'd relaxed a lot of the stuff, and I know he wasn't comfortable with that.
Interesting.
Yeah, it sounds elitist, but it wasn't. It was just the
how
things
old was
that,
he then? How old was he when that happened, and how old were you?
gosh, I was about 14, so he'd have been mid-30s.
Okay.
I can't do sums, you work it out. He was young anyway, and he'd been very engaged with the church, very involved indeed with the physical church. You know, we knew the priests that were the parish priests wherever we lived. He would enact stuff, he would read stuff, he would be part of they're not exactly mystery plays, but the Catholics will have a ceremony on, for instance, Good Friday, where they read the Gospels, and he would be very much part of that, wearing a white robe and a big cord.
Oh, really?
Oh,
he
yes,
really got serious about this.
Oh, he was dead serious. And also, I just remembered, he was
wow.
Oh gosh, what are they called? There's a group within the church called that's right, the Tertiary Franciscans. He was a tertiary of the Order of St. Francis. And his name in that church, sorry, you choose a name, it's a bit like a confirmation. The name that he chose was Brother Aquinas, of course, you know, the church's intellectual of the day. I've still got his joining thing somewhere. And that meant he was entitled to be buried wearing the cord with the 3 knots in it, which he often talked about, but I don't think it happened.
I would like to ask a question, Vanilla, because I think that both John and me have got the impression from our conversations with the Stafford that also the time that he spent in Tibet and his relationship with, his introduction to Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and so on, had an influence in the development of the VSM. And he talks about that I think as you think in that book, he talks about the VSM from a Buddhist perspective as well.
Yeah, from a Buddhist perspective already. Ooh la la. Yeah, because of course Buddhism and Catholicism are not unknown to one another. I don't know if you know the works of Thomas Merton, but he wrote extensive, and I know Stafford and I would talk about Merton. He was a monk, and he was trying to engage the Catholic Church with the Buddhist practice. He was interesting. The church loathed him, and he died in mysterious circumstances. Yeah. anyway, so Stafford was very au fait with these currents and with contemporary theology, as well as the classical stuff, the Brother Aquinas stuff. You're obviously familiar, Peter, with the Catholic practice.
Well, somewhat. I mean, I grew up in a very Church of England, you know, we had the Roman Catholic in our church, in our school, was limited to a certain number, as were the Jewish. I mean, and they were all called left footers. But you know, I'm on my second Catholic wife, and I've had sort of lots of. So I'm just really interested in the formation in young years of mental structures and how that then impacts later work. And it's just fascinating to me how, you know, it took him to his 30s maybe, or you know, late 20s, and a marriage and your birth and upbringing and so on, and the level of intensity, if I can put it that way, of this engagement, which I had no awareness of until you've just mentioned it, which I think helps me put the VSM and his work in well, a richer context, let's put it that way.
Well, let's not forget, you're familiar with all this stuff. So the practice of prayer in Catholic circles is very strong. We had family rosary, you know,
Right.
Sunday nights, the family that stays together prays together, or vice versa. So
Right.
so he would lead the rosary once a week with the kids.
Oh, really?
I know. Yeah, it's unheard of nowadays, isn't it? In fact, he went to Rome and brought me a rosary back that had been blessed by the Pope in some ceremony, which I regret I've lost.
I mean, you can, yes, I see John Lee's got his hand up, so I just don't want to
sorry.
hold, but I mean, the interesting connection between faith and Roman Catholic and water is another tangent that at some point I'd love to explore. But anyway, let John Lee answer his question.
John Lee.
Thank you for doing this, Benella. This is a really wonderful, I mean, this is as exciting as we hoped it would be. What you're doing is, so I am the proud owner of a vanilla beer. I am the author of the Reader's Guide to Platform for Change. And so within the Reader's Guide, I have the answer to Peter's question. So this is from page 352 from the Reader's Guide. I used to think about that when, still barely 20, I confronted confusion, alienation, and a messy death in the dividing continent of India. Jingoism was out, the Raj was a no-no, but the Garrison Church kept the Wags at the back. All my real friends for a couple of years in India were Wags. At last, I perceived that the received ethic had a busted gut. I threw out all my extra military effort into understanding these new friends, learning Hindi, studying the Indian language and yoga, bouncing off Islam, thinking about Buddhism, and trying to hold the balance between all of this and my own Western and Christian culture by becoming profoundly immersed in the explicitly Franciscan ethic. Now, I've addressed about 20 things that you guys were just talking about, but the next paragraph is my favorite paragraph in the book. It seems clear to me that cultures could be bridged, that all worthwhile ethics mapped onto each other under some transformation. While retired Indian Army veterans were still lecturing in England about the natives and how Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs could not mess together in the case an infidel shadow fell across the cooking pot and so forth, I was sitting around campfires with all of them, eating sweetmeats and singing, and I'm not going to try and justify the words. Majak is a mosque, Mandir is a Hindu temple, and Gajrawala is a Sikh temple. The line in the song says that the gods of the three places are one. I always wanted to get in the word girga, meaning church, but it did not fit the music. That's how much Stafford was in sync with the culture he was in.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I believe
24. it. And then my last point is, he went from there to teaching the British soldiers to be literate. He taught him basic English and how to read. And it's out of those two things and then going to the steel mill that he got the BSM. It is techno-social. It is not just technical. It's about the people communicating.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. And I have to tell you, I've been to that Garrison church. I went to India and I couldn't not go to see it. And I went and saw the parish priest there, who was in fact a Hindu convert to Catholicism, which would have perked Stafford up no end. It was a very interesting experience. I could envisage him as a young man being earnest. I didn't realize they kept the women out the back. That would have upset him. Yeah. Sorry, I should have read that book. I probably have, but I've forgotten it. So yeah, he looked for inclusivity and union. And this figures throughout his thinking, actually. I mean, we all know how he had a sideways look at everything. Every proposition you could come up with, he had another take on it. And I think it was because he believed in inclusivity in a kind of weird way. Anyway, sorry, another question, please. Alfredo, hello. I don't know if I'm supposed to switch Alfredo. Oh, he's doing it.
Yeah, right. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up between Catholicism and the Bible system. I mean, it seems a bit odd, but Ratzinger, Benedict just died, the Pope, and he was a famous theologian. And I've been reading a lot about his work, and he believed that Catholic doctrine provided a grammar rules within which people could engage, and people's views then were true or false only dependent upon whether they obeyed the grammar. And I've been thinking very much the last 2 days, just by chance, about the Bible system is actually similar to that. The Bible system sets up an overall structure which Stafford believed was true, provable, and within that structure you're allowed to have various interpretations as long as you don't disagree with the actual rules of the structure. So I've been thinking about that before you ever mentioned it, but I was just thinking about that. It's quite an interesting juxtaposition of two views, I think. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, it's a thought, isn't it? I mean, he was also, as you know, I'm sure, very familiar with the work of Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah.
And he came up with the new sphere. I mean, and of course, Jung and what did Jung call his sphere? Anyway, all the people he liked had this sense of a contact with living things.
Yeah, we talked a lot about de Chardin, and I think in that it was about recursion. Teilhard had an idea of recursion, and things sort of recurse into higher levels and higher levels and higher levels.
Yeah,
I think that was Stafford and I had a lot of talks about that.
Well, that's also alchemical thinking, isn't it? And then you start thinking about Jung and his work with alchemy.
Yeah,
and of course he introduced me to Jung. Yeah, so very rich field. Sorry, John, you've got a hand up.
You are muted, John. John, you are muted. Yep, that's good.
Okay, am I there?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think, I went to the Mondragon cooperatives in northern Spain in my youth, and I was fascinated the way they worked. And we had some meeting with some of their experts, and I said, okay, what are the key concepts? And they say the things that are really important to Mondragon are, number one, autonomy, and number two, synergy.
Oh.
And I was thinking, well, that's interesting. And I said, you didn't have this guy called Stafford Beer advising you some time ago, did you? And they said, certainly not. And I'd always found that quite strange, that Mondragon, which was set up by a Catholic priest, Arismendi, just at the end of World War II, had they're probably the closest economy I've ever come to. in comparison to the VSM, and everything they did mapped onto it really closely. It's quite extraordinary. And I was having this conversation with a guy in Dublin some years later, and he said, well, of course, it's just straightforward Catholic economics, isn't it? And I said, I wasn't aware there was a Catholic economics. And he said, oh no, there's a whole body of knowledge that comes out of the Catholic Church on how to run an economy. And I've never been able to find it. The only person who said he'd seen it was the man who runs the peer-to-peer foundations. What, do you remember his name, Angela? Anyway, he said he'd been on
Michel
the
Bowens.
Yeah, Michel Bowens. Yeah, very good. And he said he'd been on the Vatican website and actually found this, which I've tried and failed to do. So if anybody ever comes across this, I think it's a very interesting piece of work looking at Stafford's, well, started off in the Church of England, I think, and then became a Catholic, and the VSM emerges during his Catholic period, and how that maps onto the Catholic view of how an economy should work. I think fascinating stuff to do.
Well, as Peter was talking about how minds are trained and how I don't know if we're talking about actual creation of neural pathways, which make we are good. You can see that would carry on down the ages. I mean, I know when Stafford became a Catholic, one of the many things that interested him was the fact that they did have this corpus, this massive body of wisdom, which he believed that one person couldn't know God, but maybe this team that had been working for years and years could get it together. Sorry, I don't know why I went down that route.
Well, because you know, brain of the firm and heart of enterprise. I mean, that's at the core of his modeling approach, and so understanding where he came from with that, I think, is very helpful. So I'm thrilled to have this discussion, like John. Brilliant.
Raul has a question.
Vanilla,
hello, Raul.
You were starting to talk about the three spiritualities of Stafford. And the first one was the Catholic. And you were starting to talk about Chile. And for one reason or another, if I am not wrong, Peter's reason, you moved to a different thing. And
sorry.
Altogether, this has gone in the direction of that first spirituality of Catholicism. Now,
sorry, yes, I should have dwelt on that, because we know what a huge impact Chile had on him. But there were various incidents, like that mandala he was given. I don't know the story of the mandala, but he was given a mandala that expressed his self, which he had on the wall at the cottage. And he was fascinated by it. I think, if memory serves, it kind of illustrated in coloured felt the chakric ascent of, I don't think it was called Kundalini, I think it was called something else, but it was clearly a map of a spiritual state. And he was just bewitched by it. He got that from Chile. Maybe Angela knows about that. Do you?
Well, I do remember very well. I do remember very well the mandala, and I remember him talking about it and the meaning for him, and that was very influential in his arts, because when he started developing the arts, he was very much into developing the different aspects of the meaning of the mandala. Yeah. So that's what I remember, but I don't want to interrupt Raul's question, because actually
it's not a question. It's trying to get something in that direction. That did you hear Mandala Naranjo as a Chilean contributor to Stafford's thinking?
I don't remember the name.
Well, there were a number of people in Chile who were basically following the direction of Buddhism, and one of them was a man called Naranjo, who really had a lot of influence in Stafford's work in those days. So there were a number of factors that were coming together as Stafford became more interested in mandalas and became more interested in all those aspects of Buddhism. So
Well-
I think that these are two directions in a way. One is the direction of history, and the other one is the direction of spirituality, and how is
Yeah.
it that has moved.
Well, at
Well-
that time, don't forget that in the Europe world, there was a huge explosion of alternative theology. Carlos Castaneda, remember him? He came out of the woodwork and had a huge impact on everyone.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
he brought Castaneda's work into Chile,
Oh, did he?
and
La, la, la.
and he had all of us reading Journey to Ixtlan or the teachings of Don Juan, and all
Good.
the things that were the sort of very fundamental thinking.
Exactly.
At the
But at the
spiritual
same
level.
time, the Nag Hammadi texts were being translated, the Dead Sea Scrolls, yeah? So they were suddenly available, they became available in English. And there were the words of the man we call Jesus, or the teacher of righteousness, came out of the woodwork that hadn't been sanctioned by the church. You know, these were doctrines or writings that had been hidden forever and suddenly available. And Stafford referred to them as a time bomb. He said God left them there for that particular period, so we could all have a different view, freed from the patriarchal structure of the church. He was taken with those as well. So all this was going on. You know, you've got alternative Christian views with the mouth of the master, as it were, so it seemed. You've got Castaneda, you've got, who else was around in those days?
Well, I think Stephen Davis has been contributing with something. If you go to the WhatsApp, to the
chat.
clearly the Arica school had a significant influence. Arica is the further north city in Chile.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
again,
his work had an impact on John Lilly, who wrote those books, which I'm sure you remember, The Centre of the Cyclone.
Center of the Cyclone, yeah, that was
Extraordinary things.
amazing.
Yeah.
Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, who was that? It wasn't
John
Lilly.
Allegro,
I mean,
yeah.
these books were suddenly everywhere
Mm.
and fabulously thrilling. And Stafford, of course, knew them all inside out before we'd even been down to the library. Yeah.
Vanilla, there was another question that we would like you to explore, linking to what Raul was saying, and he said there was a huge change in the personality of Stafford and his principles and his life after Chile. How would you describe this dramatic change in Stafford's personality and interest and everything?
Golly, where to start? Well, the first thing was this dreadful blow. You know, the whole thing just absolutely destroyed. He was wretched. He cried a lot. But then, of course, you know, they set about, I mean, that's when we met Raul. He turned up in the family home, and the whole business of trying to plot a counter coup, which, I mean, Stafford was delighted that he could take his Chilean friends to the Athenaeum where they were plotting the counter coup. You can imagine his joy in that. So he did everything he could. I have a photocopy of the text that he sent as a telegram asking the British government to I should get this right. Hang on, maybe it's here. Yes, good. Can I read you this? It's to the Foreign Secretary at Downing Street, Southwest 1, and it's dated the 14th of September, 1973. Was advisor to Chilean government for the last 2 years, stop. Had last meeting with Allende 26th of July, stop. Most strongly urge as British subject, we do not recognize illegal junta, stop. call for protection for accredited ambassador Alvaro Bunster, now displaced, now apparently displaced, sorry, stop. And it's signed Professor Stafford Beer. So, you know, he was trying to help. I grant you it's not taking to the streets, but it's a step. And then, of course, his whole personal life just went belly up. His wife, Sally, she didn't get it. You know, she thought the whole thing was, I don't know what she thought actually, but she didn't get it. And of course, Stafford really wanted to remove himself and find out other stuff. He needed to be alone. And so it came to pass. He managed to persuade Sally to go and live with the little children, with Polly and Harry in Wales. And it was agreed that he could be 30 miles away in his cottage, so he'd be accessible, but not actually available. She was, and the children were discouraged from just dropping in. And that's what happened, you know, he gradually got himself resurrected. Not the drinking on the head, not the smoking on the head, learnt Welsh, learnt to spin, and generally restructured who he was, I think. Does that answer you, Ralph?
Vanilla, I was very much in those days with Stafford. And clearly he moved from his magnificent house in West Byfleet with a Rolls Royce and all the rest, trying to look for a simple, humble house in Wales. And that was in itself, you know, one of the processes in which he got involved, and he started to recognize that a small cottage in the middle of Wales was a better solution to his personal spiritual life. And it's from there that he decided to sell West Byfleet and to get rid of the Rolls Royce, and altogether he got, shall we say, a rather poor person in terms of his wealth.
Oh yeah.
And that in a way was very, very significant, because from being the successful big man that you knew in the first part of his life, in this second part of his life, he became very simple, very humble, and not wealthy at all. And in a way, he was all the time arguing how poor he was, and that was very essential to his development in those years.
Yes, indeed it was. I mean, he was at that time paying alimony to my mother, and it was a vast amount of money. And she'd insisted that my two brothers, the two youngest, would go to a Catholic public school. And apparently he'd agreed that she could have whatever education she wanted for the children. I don't think he anticipated that, but he had to pay for the fees for that as well. So apart from managing Sally and the two children by her, he'd got my mother's alimony and the two children by her left at home. So, I mean, that's expensive, isn't it, Raoul?
It
Poor
was,
man.
I can tell you.
Yes, I'm sure. So I don't know how on earth he managed all that. I know the royalties from the books were, oh, well, there weren't that many at that time, were there? I mean, there were some and they were selling, but I don't know how he managed it.
No, I think the main source of his income in those days was in Canada.
Yes, but that came slightly later, didn't it? Before
I think it was Manulife and the insurance company in Canada was very, very central to himself surviving financially
Yes,
in those early in the
middle years. Yeah.
70s, in the 1970s. And yes, I think as you are very aware of that, he was suffering dramatically from there. He had problems with his heart, problems with his health in general, and clearly those years from 1973 to 1978 were not easy at all.
No, no. And yes, I have letters from him then, and he was pretty desperate a lot of the time. And it took the toll on his health. As you say, he had trouble with his heart. But also, I think the kind of difficulties were exhausting him. He complains a lot of tiredness, which had never occurred before. Poor man.
Yeah, but I don't know, but the memory that I have when I met him, that was later on, when he already was in the cottage and working in Canada and already living with Elena in that new period. I think that the image that people like me had of him was still the image of an amazingly bright, vibrant, energetic, and really, really, really unique character, very, very strong character, physically and spiritually and intellectually, of course. So, I mean, he did have an amazing strength even after the tragedy, even after resigning to his money, because it's not that he lost it, that he gave up his fortune, and he made this decision to concentrate on his spirituality and his writing, because it was also in this period that he completed all the books, no? Wasn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, most of us who knew him have seen him pull himself together and go forth when he had to give a lecture, when he had to be around people. He could go from in pain and distress and awkwardness to bosh, full on. And this business of following your star, I mean, there's something in it, you know. He really had a vision that he played a role in, and that says it. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else is asking questions, because we had a group of questions that, I mean, yes, Marcus Schwaninger.
Marcus, where are you? Oh, Marcus.
I think that you are muted, Marcus. And we cannot see your video either.
Perhaps he's got bored waiting and gotten Marcus.
He'd say that he had bad signal.
Oh yes,
Did
that's
you hear
right.
me?
His signal comes and goes, doesn't it?
Did you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello.
can.
What I told about Maniac. Hello?
Sorry.
I said something about mania.
Mania.
I think I have to start again.
Yes.
Stafford was a loving man and he was a laughing man.
Yeah.
And he was a maniac.
A maniac.
A maniac. And I see it very much. I mean, in his fascination, he was fascinated. He was ecstatic. He was enraptured. Mania comes from the word mania, Greek and Latin, and it means something like obsession and frenzy. So I'm not surprised. I have to. I think one can state that if he said it himself. Decision and control. No page written before 10 p.m.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? So you need obsession and all that.
Yeah.
So my question is, did that maniac side of his, and I'm talking about before 73, in that phase before 73, did that affect the family somehow?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, he was such fun. He'd play games, you know. He'd have us all in the garden playing strange cricket games that weren't cricket, you know. Yeah, he was enormous fun. You know what he was like, Marcus. He was a maniac. That's rather good. And there was no downtime. Like when we were all round a dining table, he would direct the conversation and he wanted to know what we were doing. He wanted to know what we were thinking. He'd steer us and referee. That's right. It was like running a debating chamber, I think. But he did it with such finesse and such elegance. And he was always making games. He made games for us to try and teach us to spell. We got through that quite quickly, you know. Nobody wants to be taught to spell, but we did have other games. Yeah, maniac, that's good. And he loved all the simple things. He loved to cook. He loved to make appalling food. He'd make us sugar and syrup sandwiches. Yeah, so they're kind of crunchy and sweet. They were delicious. But, you know, he was diabetic. and most of my brothers now are diabetic. It's not really surprising. Yeah, he was great. Maniac. Good word.
Thank you.
Philippe, do you want to say something?
That's right. Thank you, Vanilla. I'm not the Stafford intimus in any way. I heard him talk once in 2001 in Vienna, which was very late in his life. And I happened to be reading his American diary from his 1960 trip during the Christmas holidays, which is very entertaining because there's enormous energy actually, you know, that in those pages. But clearly one of the people he bonded very well with in the United States was Warren McCulloch. And there seems to be some kind of, you know, almost spiritual relationship between these two men, because Warren was also a very spiritual man, was also thinking of joining the ministry early on in his life. Also the remoteness, so to speak, of his cottage that he built in I think it was in New England somewhere. It's quite clear that impressed Stafford to a very high degree. So I just wonder to what extent that relationship with Warren has been influential in making, in his later choices, perhaps, to, you know, withdraw.
I can't answer that, but I do know that he was very fond of Warren McCulloch. He came to see us in the house in Sheffield when I was a girl, and I never forgot him. He was extraordinary. He was one of those people that took children seriously. You know, he'd sit down and talk with you. He was interested in what you had to say, and he told me all about Francis Bacon, the friar. Francis Bacon, not the painter, and was fascinating. I never forgot that. He was a lovely man. But yes, Stafford and he were thick as thieves. I can see your point. I think there was a deep bond between them. Yeah. I don't know how much it influenced him.
I may say that Stafford saw Warren McCulloch as one of the persons who actually steered him in life.
Yeah, a mentor, I think.
A mentor. So it wasn't really someone he saw at the same level. He saw Warren as someone who really was steering him into his developments. At one point, I remember asking Stafford about this mentorship, and he came clearly saying Warren was the one that he considered to be his mentor, rather than, for instance, Ashby. So, well, personally, I thought Ross Ashby was the one who had influenced his work tremendously. He felt it was important to recognize Warren, which in a way was the connection that he had also with people like Maturana, Umberto Maturana, and Francisco Varela. So all that as a side of Stafford's work was strongly influenced by Warren McCulloch.
Yeah. And his relationship with, gosh, what's his name? The guy who founded cybernetics.
We
No,
know.
Norbert Wiener.
Thank you, Norbert Wiener. I mean, that was, I mean, he was in awe of Wiener, certainly. Is it pronounced Wiener or Fino?
Well, you know very well when Stafford went to visit Norbert Wiener came out of his office and embraced Stafford, and said, "You are the father of organizational cybernetics."
Yes, yes, lovely.
So that,
But he didn't have that close friendship with him, at least I wasn't aware of it, that he had with Warren McCulloch.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
think, but in any case, Norbert Wiener also went to your house in England.
No, he didn't. He didn't make it. He died he was on his way when he died.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. So I missed him. I got most of the greats in my girlhood. You know, I've talked with these great men. I've had a very blessed life, but I missed him, alas. Yeah.
I would like to go back to that because there were other really interesting friends of Stafford that we would like you to tell us about his friendships. But we have Marta and Czeslaw.
Yes, please, Marta.
Questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh no, yes, thank you. No, it's this is also a question about one of his, I suppose, one of his friends who is Umberto Maturana. So just put him on the list, and if you have something to say about their relation, more than the scientific things or whatever, but the relation, that would be really very interesting.
No, not particularly, except that I met Umberto in Vienna at the McCulloch conference, I think. No, it wasn't. It was someone else's conference. Anyway, it was a long time ago.
Robert Truppel.
Sorry?
Robert Truppel.
Okay, no.
In
But
Vienna.
anyway, I was in Vienna for a conference and there were all cyberneticians there. And there was Umberto. So I went charging up and said, "I'm Stafford's daughter." And he said, "Oh, your father made me a cybernetician." And I said, "What?" And he said, when Stafford arrived in Chile, he said, "Bring me Umberto." And that was the first time he'd known about cybernetics. So after that, you know, he was kind of thrown into the pot. That's all I have to offer on that.
That's great. Good to know. Thank you so much.
Czeslaw.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Vanilla. It's very, very impressive for me to see private side of a very great scholar. But coming back to cybernetics and the origins and so on, I'm working on a kind of broad methodology of complexity studies that I try to continue, but precisely. For me, this is something natural that people who are mathematically skilled could be associated with the spirituality and mysticism.
Oh.
They could be either against or they could be involved. Why? Because they deal always with a holistic approach, then with the paradoxes of infinity, zero, infinity, and so on and so forth. And when I'm listening to you, I discover something extra that I've already known, that Stafford Beer was very much inspired by different types of mysticism, because the mysticism seeks for simplicity. For instance, I don't know whether I will be able to pronounce it correctly in English, but for instance, it's all the stories with the let's say Buckminster Fuller and then team's integrity, and this geometrical tensegrity and so on, so forth. It's with all those geometric shapes, which are at the same time universal, but at the same time also mystical. You have the simplicity in the holiness. And for me, I'm always trying to psychologize. When I look at a politician or a scientist, I think, what could be some psychological motives? And for me, Stafford Beer was an excellent example, mixing up high intellectual quality with the deep inspiration from spirituality. For instance, when you look at Ludwig von Bertalanffy, he was very much inspired by Nikolai de Cusa about hierarchy, ignorance, and so on. What is surprising, I will finish with this, that I thought that the VSM had an inspiration from that mystical sources of India, Buddhism, and I'm surprised that you are saying that the VSM was inspired purely or predominantly on Catholic. No,
I'm sure it wasn't solely.
so because somebody, maybe not you, but somebody has just mentioned it. I remember working still quite correctly. So somebody has mentioned this. So it was also for me to show that simplifying the holistic approach, or the universal, and what more also is the possibility, what is hidden behind all those mystical searches is also the capability to control. There's something which is sitting very deeply in the mind of everybody who is using the holistic approach, maybe for good, and I want to help you, I want to help how to control. Summing it up, thank you for showing the fact that I did not so well known, but what do you think about this relation, about the natural, psychological, and mental features of Stafford beer connected with search for spirituality, mysticism, and the results in practice, cybernetics of management, the VSM, and supporting Chile? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gosh, that's covered a lot of ground, hasn't it? I'm reminded of Buckminster Fuller. Of course, Stafford was a friend of his. I didn't know them together. I was aware of Buckminster Fuller as a young artist. He came and spoke at my college. So I thought he was fabulous. So Stafford and I often talked of him, but what else have we touched on? Yes, I'm thinking of what you're saying about this spiritual bent, but thinking about mathematicians and scientists, how many of them there are that after a certain age start going mystical? Look at Isaac Newton. I mean, before you know it, he's come up with all this science stuff, loads of maths, and then he's off on the God thing. He's come up with some wonderful God stuff, actually. He was a bit mad, but I like him. And Swedenborg, Europe's biggest scientist in 17, whatever it was, and then turns out all this mystical stuff. I think it's part of being an intelligent, searching human. You'd be foolish not to consider these dimensions in being a human. Even people who think that when you drop dead, that's it, even they are often curious and interested in the possibilities of parallel dimensions. You know, that's come up a lot lately. String theory is offering us all sorts of theological possibilities, or non-theological possibilities, which in that case turns out to be the same thing as far as I can see. Anyway, sorry, I don't know if there was a question there, and I don't know if I've answered it, but I loved your observations.
Yes, very briefly. It was just a comment that I see something in common, that there are the links. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is, let's say, a keen believer or so, but just something to search something which is probably or not hidden behind it, to search for inspiration. As I said, simple geometric structures with such fascinating capabilities to allow me to shape the structure of the team, of management team, integrity.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So that's all.
Like the tree of life structure, you know, that which Stafford used as a basis for his paintings that were exhibited in Liverpool Cathedral. You had to walk that route because he saw it as so profoundly important, and it's used everywhere. The tree of life, it's used in alchemy, it's used to show the Jesuits use it to show the path of David, and anyway, it's dead. Yeah, it figures everywhere. These geometric forms are important to us for some reason.
Vanilla, I would like now to you to tell us a little bit, how did the Stafford influence your interest in esoteric studies, and how did you end up going that way? How was the conversation between you and Stafford about the esotericism?
Oh, well, we both talked a lot to each other about the things that were interesting us. And of course, he'd always been interested in all that stuff. And he introduced me to a lot of Jung, which I hadn't known about, which of course, Jung had saved all the alchemical stuff that was being binned by intellectuals across Europe. So he'd got all that together. How did he, gosh, well, we talked about everything. So yeah. And the stranger, the better, the more interesting it was to both of us, the more obscure and the more irrelevant, perhaps, but that's not the case. I mean, if any of us found a new, if anyone in the family, I'm not saying this is just me, found a new book on something, then the news would flash. And David Whitaker, you know, everybody's favorite bookseller, would be flogged to death trying to find out the latest in whatever new ideas were coming through. Gosh, days before computers, you remember? Sorry, Angela, that doesn't really answer anything.
No, that's all right. No, that's all right. That's absolutely all right.
I think perhaps one connection that is worth considering is Fuller, Westminster Fuller, was an architect. That
Yes.
was the origin of his work. And he was transmitting all the aspects of structure into the design of new buildings, new structures like the dome, and that in a way had a huge synergistic component.
Yeah.
Buckminster Fuller was considered to be one of the great innovators of the 20th century and creating new ideas about.
But they had a personal link as well. You know, Buckminster Fuller lost a child very early on. It died due to bad housing, which is why he went into architecture. But first of all, he took 2 years out and refused to talk in order to learn the value of words. So you can see how that would resonate with Stafford, who also lost his first child.
Elena, you can see, Vanilla, that clearly when they started to talk about the team's integrity, Buckminster Fuller was one of those who was strengthening the notion of the dome, and I thought clearly the connection that Stafford made with that development, that it was in the 1930s when Buckminster Fuller got into the dome and the team's integrity or aspects of, and in general, aspects of synergy. So the influence of Buckminster Fuller on Stafford was very strong, and perhaps more than we often recognize, because he was several years earlier doing all these things.
Indeed, yes, I can only agree. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has another question. What yes, Jose. Jose.
Yeah, I have Vanilla in this biographic journey. There are two countries that I think that we are not well known, the interventions of Stafford, that is Uruguay and Mexico. Can you tell us something about these two? Because Chile is very well known and very well documented, and Raúl was a witness of all this period.
Yes.
So we have a lot of information. But this other, well, in the case of Mexico, Javier Livas, yes, he shared some reminds of that period. What are yours, Vanilla?
Well, mine are very slight, because by then I was whatever I was, I don't know. But Elena's the one to talk to, because she spent time in both countries with Stafford, working on whatever they were working on. I know he was excited and committed, and as he always was. And certainly in Uruguay, he had great hopes for Uruguay, and we would follow the political circumstances there, which were always la-di-da. So Elena's your girl for that. It's
Okay.
not really my sphere. Yeah.
Okay, Vanilla, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Elena apologizes. She's not with us, but she's traveling. So she was gonna try to connect in the phone, but clearly she hasn't been able to.
I mean, that might be another day, pin her down and get those stories. It's a good direction, because I'm very vague on that time of his life and would like to know more.
No, I think the work of Stafford and Elena in Uruguay was particularly interesting, because in a way different to what happened in Chile. The group in Uruguay, the Uruguayans, were extremely well connected with Sanguinetti, the president of the day.
Yeah.
And that meant that they created in the main building of the presidency, they created an operations room. And that operations room was used by people in the government of Uruguay, and also had the opportunity to be somehow the Argentinians got interested in that, and some Central Americans as well. So Uruguay in practice had a very concrete influence in what happened after Chile, and building it to a deeper level of technical proficiency. Perhaps the only point I would make is that the Uruguayans were far more interested in information systems than in the cybernetics of society.
Yes.
And that is something that...
John.
Hello?
Yes?
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button and I've lost
Okay.
everybody.
Am I there?
Yeah,
nobody's there.
This is,
I just
Andrew
wanted to add that the influence of the work of Victor Ganon and many others in Uruguay was essentially executive information systems, and they produced results. They actually implemented the cyber filter of the day, and they were much more on top of whatever was going on in the ministries and the government of the country. And
So was it effective, Raul? They got the technology right, and was it effective?
And, well, that's what in my conversations with Ganon, I have been making him the point that they were doing very good work in executive information systems, but not very good in terms of what we consider now the central part of organizational cybernetics, and that is variety engineering. So the idea of variety engineering, the idea of creating capacity to support communications and interactions among the many members of the government and society in general was much weaker in Uruguay compared to what we were doing in Chile.
There's just a comment on that. Angela and I were lucky enough to meet the man who did most of the work in Uruguay. What's his name, Angela? Who turned
Gabriel Ramirez. That was a student.
He was one of my doctoral students, in fact, Gabriel
okay.
Ramirez.
Well, sadly died recently. He was in Bogota, and he went didn't last very long. And I asked him these questions, and he said the main problem was that the government there was very autocratic. And although they understood the information systems and the stuff that you were talking about, the whole idea about devolving control and autonomy and some of the fundamentals of the viable system model were just not acceptable to their culture. And he said that's the main reason it didn't go anywhere.
I also had the opportunity when I was working in the president's office in Colombia in the 1990s to talk to Gabriel Ramirez and to the team in Uruguay. They even sent me the software because in those days, you may remember, Raul, that we were dreaming to do a similar project in Colombia, and we even tried to get the money, and we even had a meeting with Raul and Elena and Stafford in Venezuela, trying to design the cyber filter for Colombia, and it never went anyway because we didn't got the money. It went in many other ways that we all know after that, but that project, I did have the conversations and I saw the software, and they did recognize that the Eurociv software, I mean, it was a software, but it never had all the organizational perspective. It never took into account all the politics. It never really implemented seriously the VSM philosophy. It was more seen like a performance management system, an executive information system to support the government, but never had all the other dimensions of cybernetics that, like Raul says. And by the end, they didn't have the power in terms of, and the impact that it should have had, because it was very technocratic oriented. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it often happens, doesn't it, where the techniques overpower the point.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there are several questions here. I can see, well, Javier, you want to?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Manila, we have never spoken.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I want to ask you a very straightforward question about Stafford. Do you think Stafford was a socialist?
Yes.
Or was he a Berian? Wasn't he more a Berian than a socialist?
What do you mean Berian?
Well, he thought more about the viable system model than about the ideology sort of thing.
No, I can't agree with that. I mean, Stafford was.
If you say yes, I'll take your. I ask you, and I'm going to respect your answer. Okay. Now the other question: was he a libertarian?
No, he had a very liberal approach to life, but libertarian
Or what
implies.
is designing freedom about?
Sorry. I mean, I think. Sorry, this is rather a bad link, Javier. I think libertarian has an extra dimension meaning in English. It means thoughtless for other people and taking what you want, and he was not like that. Au contraire. I mean, he may have had his own approach to life, but he was very conscientious and very careful of other people, always. And I don't know if that's what you were asking. I'm sorry.
No, okay, I'll take your answer. I just wanted to sort of get it out of the way.
Okay.
I have my own views of how he thought, what he wanted, what his life goals were.
You spent a great deal of time with him, didn't you?
One-on-one with him.
Yeah, one-on-one.
Okay.
He wrote me a lot during that period, so
And
I'm familiar with it.
I would not.
So,
okay. Well, all I can say about Mexico is a total, okay. The only thing random he left for the president in an interview that appeared in the newspaper that I still hold. It's in Spanish, and he predicted a lot of the bad things that have happened to Mexico since, okay, and are still happening. We never recovered from being so stupid and not listening to him, okay. Now, the other thing, and I'm going to say this a little bit disappointed with the group, is that I have worked with my brother, especially my brother Hernan, and I think honestly that Hernan, my brother, found all the connections of the VSM to the Christian writings of San Pablo, and the letters to the Ephesians, letters to the Corinthians, clearly describe the Bible system model. I don't know how much Stafford was influenced by this, but my brother worked about 20 years making all the mappings, and you have the mappings not only of what San Pablo calls the body of Christ, which is the church.
Can I
but
tell you
also,
how Stafford was engaged with St. Paul, as we call him? He did some computer simulations in using, not simulations, but some computer analysis of the works of St. Paul, which concluded that St. Paul was in fact 3 separate people. The writings can be broken down. I mean, there's explanations for this. They can be, you know, scribed by people taking notes and getting them different, if you see what I mean. But anyway, he was very interested in St. Paul indeed, but not perhaps in the way you are. The body of the church, of course, that's an important aspect of Catholic thinking.
well, what we did is documented on a video that I have in YouTube called the management lessons of the Bible, the body of Christ.
Okay.
That's about an hour and a half. So I'm a little surprised that maybe most of you are not familiar with it or haven't seen it or watched it. The Catholic or the Christians at the level of the church, the family, the person, and the business. I think Trevor was asking about the business side. Well, there are some insights on how a Christian would approach business there. Okay.
Yep.
So I hope some of you will find it interesting. I am not saying that Stafford did not later in his life try to integrate everything. He was an integrator. He took ideas from that I noticed from Wiener, from Ashby, from von Forster, from Maturana, and he managed to lump them all together into the viable system and made it grow and become more and more, let's say, faithful to the way nature works. Okay. So that's all I have to say right now. And I
At least
appreciate
it's organic, Javier.
Yes.
Peter.
Yeah, could I, I'm fascinated that you started this talking about the 3 phases of Stafford's life, because obviously 3 is a fundamental concept in the Christian church and in structures of triangles, and then all the geometric forms that follow on. But this 3rd phase, I'm fascinated because I went and spent 3 nights in the cottage.
Oh la la.
And then, you know, this period of poverty, but then in a sense, his embracement of management and commercial business with his relationship with Fredman Malik. And I wondered if you've got any perspectives on that phase, the 3rd phase, if you will, of his life, and then the relationship with Malik and the whole family of Malik and what they've done with Stafford's work.
Well, of course, Stafford's been dead since they inherited his work, as it were. So I can't speak for him. They've certainly changed a great deal of the processes, made them much more management friendly. I can't tell you how effective that is because I'm not party to that debate. Perhaps someone else knows. The Malik tribe. Yeah, Marcus, you know them well.
Yes.
Does it work?
I worked for that organization a long time ago, but I was with them 6 years. And well, when Stafford was here as a guest professor in 1990, he met Malik and they negotiated the future of the legacy, of the scientific legacy of Stafford, and Malik acquired it. He acquired the rights to explore it. And what he did with it, well, he had a very successful consulting and training organization. The management, it was called Management Center, and then it was called Malik Management Center. And so they focused very much on the use of teams integrity. Several approaches to working with Stafford's work, for example, the VSM, the operations room, and they did a lot in that vein. But I think quantitatively, what they did most was realize integrations in all kinds of contexts, namely industrial firms, private and public firms, all kinds of organizations, also non-profit organizations, and a very interesting cases. I think it was one or two cases where they worked at the level of a community, a municipal level. So they used this with the people of, it was St. Veit in Austria. And now Malik came up with the second step. And the second step was what he called supers integrity, or supers integration. And that was a way to insert several specialists of different systems, approaches or methodologies, and they were a part of the InfoSet. InfoSet is a set of people who engage in a integration. Now, he had, for example, one person who was very strong in VSM, one person who was very strong in what they call the sensitivity model, which is a kind of qualitative system dynamics created by Frederick Vester. Really a great 7 edition at this part, in this part.
Vester.
Some have heard of Vester, yes, Vester. And actually, when Stafford was here, it was very nice. Vester was a guest professor at our university. He was really a great guy and very famous and all that. And I could arrange that they were sitting together at a table during I took Stafford to the faculty meeting. There was a big faculty meeting with everybody of the management faculty. Not only the top guys, not only the full professors, but all down to the assistants. It was a big thing, you know. And then Stafford and Vester were sitting at this table together, and I think it was a very, very good meeting. They understood each other very well. And so, to come back to Malik, syintegration, hypersyintegration, or he inserted these specialists, like 4 or 5 people, 6 people, up to 6 people, and they participated in this integration. And they used the 3 days or 2 days, whatever they used. They used them to diagnose the organization in focus. And at the end, they came up with all the insights they had created, and that was apparently very valuable. So Malik always said integration costs $0, you know, it costs so and so much, but what you save is much more than that. So you have a profit out of doing this integration. And well, he gave us a number a few years ago. He said, well, we are at 500 integrations now and beyond. More than 500 integrations done in all these years.
Perhaps I can add something there. I think the emphasis that several people have put into executive information systems and to make more efficient the transmission of information to particular managers and people in organizations is something that, as I was saying earlier, in the case of Uruguay, was very, very significant. And I have seen applications of the VSM which have been strongly influenced by this idea of executive information systems. One of the things that has been evolving, and one of the points that I believe is important to recognize as the implication of Stafford's work in the future, is that it is, Javier was saying, is it a socialist or beerist? I would say the real point there is that to apply all these ideas of VSM only as information transmission is very limited. And what really is required is to apply all these ideas of variety engineering in the wider sense. And that in that respect, the idea is not to make the system more information efficient, but is to make the communications and interactions of people in different aspects of society, starting from the local problems to the global problems, and to understand the VSM not as an information system, but as a communications system. And that is what I believe have been left with a limited development over the years. And one aspect that I believe is very important that we pursue that and go further with that into the future.
Well, this is really fascinating. I am aware that we are running out of time, and I don't know if people want to stay for a bit longer, or shall we say this is enough? I don't know. I can see that Javier and Andy still have a few questions. Very short questions, very short comments.
No, it's not a question. It's just a statement of fact. I know for a fact that the Malik were in charge of the reorganization of Volkswagen company at the world level to meet the challenge of the Tesla electric vehicle cars, okay? And they did that using integration and using the VSM model.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Can I, oh, damn it, I've lost you all. Are you there?
Yes, we're here. Yeah.
Sorry, I've lost everything. Hang on a minute. I wanted to say something personal. If I can, oh, there you are, good. Yes, a long time ago, when I was in fact studying theology, I did a VSM on the Catholic Church, because Stafford always said it was a marvelous example of an organization that was built to survive. And I did a VSM because I wanted to find out what would happen to the Catholic Church if they persisted in rejecting women, in leaving them as second-class members of their organization. And the VSM showed it would collapse. So I went to Stafford and said, "Woo, look, the church is going to collapse." And he said, "Darling, you can get the VSM to prove anything you want."
Yeah.
It's a thought to leave you with.
Yeah, lovely. Well, anyway, I don't know, Andy, I mean, your question is quite heavy and more academic. Andy, do you want to do it, or just leave it as a comment for a later discussion?
I'm very happy to leave it. It's I was just interested in whether he did it by whether he won people over by force of personality, or whether he had some techniques.
Who's Stafford?
Stafford, yeah.
What would his techniques be?
Oh, thinking about how he would actually change cultures. So techniques that would engage people.
Oh, I think that comes under force of personality.
Mm.
I don't know. He didn't use hypnosis. He rarely drugged anyone. Yeah.
He did tell wonderful stories, which it took me quite often weeks and weeks and weeks to put in context.
Yeah.
And these things would be going around your head. and you'd be thinking, what was that all about? And then suddenly it'd click. So
Yeah.
maybe I don't know if he did that deliberately or
Oh,
whether
I'm sure he did. I had that all my life, you know. He'd tell jokes, you know, and he'd tell you a joke and you go, ha, ha, ha. And 15 years later, you think, shit, that's what he was saying.
Exactly. He was a very deep thinker. And
He
many times
was, yes,
you
and a
took-
very lovable man.
Yeah, absolutely lovable. He said to me once, you need to read my books many, many times in your life because you won't understand from the beginning. And he's right. I mean, still now, many decades later, when I read his book, I say, oh my goodness, I never understood that before.
Yes,
Or,
yes.
or otherwise you say, oh, he said that. I thought that I have said that before. And he's always in.
Yes. Well,
So,
this has been a real treat talking with you all tonight.
thank you,
Next-
Vanessa. It's been really extraordinary. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been
yeah,
lovely.
thank you, Vanilla. That was truly wonderful.
See you all again soon, I hope, in somewhere.
Yes, we are planning the Metaphorum conference this year in the UK. It's going to be in Manchester,
Oh.
9th, 10th of 11th of June. So please put that in your diaries. And it will be lovely to see many of you that haven't been able to come in the few years because we've been touring in Europe. But this year we're back to Manchester. So hope to see many of you. We will announce very soon the conference program and activities. And one of the activities will be to have some, hopefully some of you with us telling stories about the Stafford and telling stories about yourself and the development of cybernetics in the last decades. Okay. So thank you very much. And see you on the 1st of February with Catherine Farrell for the next webinar. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
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 Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
Thank
for
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.